Curse Words, presented by the Night Nerd. I'm Derek.
And I'm Colby.
And we talk comics sometimes, and sometimes we really focus in on the comics we're going to talk about. Last time we did our first comics collision in more than a year and change. This time, yes, there's a lot of news in the industry going on, a lot of weird announcements coming out lately. A lot of good books came out lately. We still haven't talked about Superman Year One.
Yeah, we haven't. God, man, we haven't.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
I said we haven't talked about that. We haven't talked about Silver Surfer Black. We haven't talked about Justice League. We haven't talked about a litany of other things.
It's true, but there was a big piece of news that came out over the last couple of weeks that really kind of had affected us kind of personally, just hit us in the heart. DC is reshuffling, rebranding, and as part of that rebrand, Beloved. This is going to be a hard episode. Beloved imprint is being shuttered. R.I.P. Vertigo Comics. And I know we both have some opinions on that. Colby, what are your thoughts?
Honestly, as someone who loves Vertigo, who loves everything that came from it for a long period of time, I think, especially with Young Animal being around now, especially with what Image is doing with all stuff, I think it is a imprint that, for lack of a better term, has kind of survived on nostalgia for too long for my taste. And I think it being ended is a good thing, because I think it opens up doors for a lot of newer things and for a new generation's version of Vertigo, or a brand new thing like Young Animal altogether. I don't think Vertigo is required to be around. To me, it kind of feels like the equivalent of Undertaker still being in WWE, where it's like, yeah, he's there, but it's not Undertaker of old. So it comes a point to hang up the gloves, and it comes a point where everything good must end. And I think Vertigo ending is not a bad thing, especially when they've already said the Sandman books will continue over. They're not canceling anything. It's just the Vertigo imprint itself, the name itself, and honestly probably the weight and expectation that comes with the Vertigo imprint will also go away, which I think is good, because I think comparing every book to Sandman is not inherently a good thing.
Yeah, I think you pretty much nailed my opinion on it right there, in that I feel like the Vertigo name has kind of become an albatross on newer books because of the legacy that so many books published under that imprint have. I mean, you mentioned Sandman, but there was, Garth Ennis and Steve Dillon's Preacher. Grant Morrison published The Invisibles and other, really well-recognized titles. Fables came out of Vertigo, was probably the last big splash in Vertigo. And, it's a name synonymous with a type of quality that has been enhanced by nostalgia to the point where pretty much no book coming out of the Vertigo banner could actually match people's memories of what Vertigo used to be. Yeah. I remember even when they did what was supposed to be a big new launch, and I think it actually may have launched even at the same time as Fables, or maybe it was Jack of Fables, but I remember when Saucer Country came out from Paul Cornell. I loved that book, and it barely made it to 15 issues because, again, people's memories of what Vertigo is supposed to mean really handicapped a lot of the books that were trying to come out under that label. It's a bummer to see such a classic imprint be taken off the table, but when your legacy is as deep and rich and impossible to live up to a standard as Vertigo, maybe it is time for that label to be put to bed, and for other labels to take their place. As you said, Young Animal, of course, Black Label is where a lot of that material is going. Apparently, and I was delighted to actually hear this. I didn't realize this was happening. Warren Ellis's Wildstorm imprint is going to continue. There's a 6-issue at minimum Wildcats miniseries from Warren Ellis spinning out of the Wildstorm. So lots of cool stuff still happening, even if we've lost a very cool and very storied banner. But speaking of losing that very cool and very storied banner, we were going to talk about our favorite stories and comics and runs to come out of Vertigo. I actually composed an entire top 5 list. Colby, I think you're going to do more of a freestyle.
Well, it's in a 5. I'll do it. It's pretty much in a 5. I think for me, it's kind of hard just because there again, especially if you're talking about from like its initiation up until like 2001 or even later, 2005.
I'd say 2003, 2005. Yeah.
there were so many big books that I'm trying to focus on the big ones because there's so many miniseries and so many things like that that I could put on here. But for me personally, I'm trying to limit it to kind of like longer form stories because there are like ones that were technically put under that label or were released, but if I do that, the list will just be either a bunch of obscure stuff or stuff that is gonna be weird to like. Again, the obvious elephant in the room, it'd be hard for me to put something like Young Liars on a list and to take off Sandman for it or something.
And see, I kind of went in the opposite direction. I only allowed myself one DC2 Vertigo book. I mean, there was a lot of books that the Vertigo line launched with that were previously DC published titles: Swamp Thing, Animal Man, Sandman, Doom Patrol. So many of their legacy comics were what made Karen Berger, or what allowed Karen Berger to start Vertigo in the first place, were comics that were created under the DC banner. The start of Grant Morrison's Doom Patrol run, his Animal Man run, Alan Moore's Saga of the Swamp Thing. Those are all technically DC comics, not Vertigo comics to begin with. So I only allowed myself one legacy book into the legacy Vertigo line. So in that, having said that, my honorable mention for this list is the Sandman.
Okay.
It did not end up being my legacy title. There was one book that I actually love a little bit more than the Sandman. One character in particular that I love a little bit more than Morpheus. So as great and wonderful and wondrous and comics changing as the Sandman was, that is honestly my honorable mention.
Oh, see, for my honorable mention, it would be some more stuff, and I have a cheeky answer on mine too. But
hey, can we pause this for just a second? My wife's calling. I'm sorry, man.
No problem.
All right, thanks.
And keep having this conversation, but on the podcast.
Totally.
Yeah, no, there's a ton of. Basically, before we get in the list, so many honorable mentions for me because I was thinking about it, and whether it be American Vampire, 100 Bullets, Scalped, Sweet Tooth, Young Liars, Preacher, Swamp Thing, Black Orchid, Clean Room, or Enigma, there were like so many books that could
I totally forgot Sweet Tooth was not an Image book. I loved Sweet Tooth. That book really introduced me to Jeff Lemire. So fucking good.
That's again, that was a book that almost would have been on my list had I remembered it was Vertigo. I had to look up a list like, oh yeah, no, that was like that. I get so there's that because there's a specific time where Jeff Lemire, I can't believe I forget his name. David Lapham. And a couple other people like did a lot of work for Vertigo, did a lot of work for Image, and they went back and forth, and so I get them confused. Like I can't remember like books like American Virgin and I can't remember if that's Vertigo or
American
Image.
Virgin was Vertigo. It might have been on my list had I actually read it. My friend Kenny, one of my best friends, really loved American Virgin when it was coming out. That was his Saucer Country. That was the book that he was like, this is great, and nobody else was reading.
Yeah, no, it was really good. I enjoyed it a lot. Actually, you want to jump in the list while we're on it?
Yeah, sure. Do your number 5, man.
Yeah, sure. So number 5, I'm gonna just for the first 2 volumes, but it was one of those books that just when I first finally read it, it caught me up in such a way that I wanted to read everything and play the video game and play all stuff. So number 5 is Fables for me.
Wonderful, good choice.
Yeah, so again, specifically probably the first 2 or 3 volumes.
See, I go all the way to issue 75.
Okay.
When the book should have ended, which was when they defeated the adversary. And then at 76 is like, oh no, there's an even bigger bad guy out there. It's like, no man, you should have just stopped it here. Honestly, the first 75 issues of Fables I think are really phenomenal. I agree.
No, it's it's not underrated because it's had a huge impact on things and has had a lot of rip-offs, a lot of other versions, but it is still a book that
once upon a time.
Yeah. If you've never read it, I know, and there's also the game, I can't think of the name of it, off the top of my head, the Telltale game, that was also very good. There's a lot of really great content from the Fables universe, tons of spin-offs, tons of stuff, and for the most part, again, at least in those first few years, were all pretty quality and pretty good. Like, there's not a lot of bad Fables out there. There's much more good Fables than bad Fables.
That's absolutely true. And there's a couple of independent, OGN's original graphic novels that are just, stories set in the Fable universe that are really fantastic.
Yeah, I can't think of the specific one. The one focus, I can't remember the title, like Wolf Among Us, I think is a Telltale game, but it's like...
That is a Telltale Delta game,
I can't remember.
There's one that focuses on the Frog Prince guy.
Yeah.
That was really good. And there's a miniseries that's been out of that. No, I'm thinking of the Sandman miniseries that Bill Willingham did called Thessaly. That was really, really good. So Bill Willingham, don't love his politics, but dude's a hell of a writer. You know, he's really very creative.
No, I think he's definitely somebody that. There were so many. Fabled is a good example of it. Was able to, even if you don't like him as a person or agree with the stuff, I think he's a good enough writer where it never affected my personal taste in the book.
It never affected the work.
Yeah.
And I think that's really impressive. For anybody of a hardline political bent, if you do not let that affect the work, I think that's really impressive. And he did. That was very much to his credit. Excellent choice, sir. I don't know if my number 5 is going to be on your list or not, since you were saying you were really trying to stay away from short form stories. My number 5, and the reason it's on here, one, I needed a Grant Morrison on here somewhere, obviously, and two, it's really, honestly, the only time I've ever really loved Philip Bond as an artist. My number 5 is Kill Your Boyfriend.
Damn, no, that was Vertigo, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. I looked it up to be sure. I had to check.
Yeah, that's another one where, don't worry, I have for Morrison, I have a cheeky answer, so it's fair enough.
But yeah, it's a really nice little take on the myth of Dionysus in an interesting way. It very broadly skewers people like me in high school who were reading, Robert Jordan, even though I fucking hate Robert Jordan now, and us fantasy nerds. But again, mostly, honestly, 90% of the reason I'm putting this book on here is I never really connected with Philip Bond as an artist on Invisibles. I've never really followed his career outside of the times he's worked with Morrison, but I genuinely love his art in Kill Your Boyfriend. It fits the tone, it fits the theme. I like his character designs in it. It's my favorite Philip Bond work by a lot, to the point where I felt like it needed a mention on this list. So that is honestly why I picked this book. I think Philip Bond's art in there is phenomenal and really worth tracking down just to see it.
Yeah, no, that is one of my all-time favorite comics, period, Kill Your Boyfriend, so I 100% agree with everything you just said on that, of course, because it's a book. I can't remember if it was when we did our top favorite books of all time. I can't remember if it was my top 10, but it was either honorable mention or in it.
I'm 90% sure it was in your top 10. I think it was in your bottom 5, but I think it was in your top 10, yeah.
I definitely want to say it was. But, I love that pick. This will be a weird one for me again, because we're doing top 5 Vertigo, and there's so many Vertigo ones, so to put this low on the list seems weird, but this honestly is probably, if we're doing kind of my favorite order, my number 4 is Sandman. And I'm just
excellent. I'm glad one of us had Sandman on the actual list.
Yeah. Well, and also for convenience sake, I'm including pretty much the spin-offs, the death sequels, all that other stuff in this, because I don't want to pick out this storyline or this or not this. Because I think, again, Sandman, much like Fable,
we're going to have an interesting discussion in about a minute.
Okay. I think, much like Fable, Sandman has a lot more good than bad, and I would argue most of Sandman is very good, and it's harder to find really crap Sandman. I think a couple of short stories. It really is. You could argue, in Endless Nights, maybe a couple of them don't land as well as you'd want them to, and
there's one of the volumes, I think volume 6, which is whatever volume it is, where it's there's an inn filled with weird creatures and people, and it's the end of Lost Things or something, and it's mostly just their stories. A couple of those don't hit quite as hard, and I think the Kindly Ones doesn't land 100%. Again, I think that's another one that has some not working Philip Bond artwork, which is unfortunate because it's the second to last volume, and it's really, really important story-wise, but I don't think all the beats hit. But yeah, overarchingly, Sandman is it's a undeniable classic for a reason. I think the ending completely works and completely lands.
Even bringing up to the more recent stuff, the recent relaunch, and before that, the J.H. Williams Overture. Even Overture, Overture was way better than it should have been. Even most of the current Sandman line is, most of it, not all of it, but most of it's way better than it should be.
The issues I've read of The Dreaming were really very solid.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
again, it launched. You said it launched some really good spinoffs. That Thessaly spinoff I read, the Dead Boy Detectives, is supposed to be pretty good. Lucifer is, some people consider Lucifer better than Sandman. And that was a direct spinoff of Sandman.
Yep. Of course, giving birth to like the Death miniseries and stuff like that, which is very well loved, and I got
to use this as a jumping off point, man. Because my number 4 is Death: The High Cost of Living.
Oh, so Sandman's not entirely not on your list.
Yeah, that's like I said. Yeah, it's my cheat answer because I feel like Death is very much a Vertigo character, whereas the Sandman concept itself started as a DC book, and Death's first appearance may have even been while the book was still a DC book, not a Vertigo book. Death is absolutely more. I think she's probably emblematic of Vertigo. I feel like her image is very much tied, and her ankh is very much tied to the Vertigo line. And again, as great as the story in Death: The High Cost of Living is, as wonderful as Neil Gaiman's prose are, holy fuck, the Chris Bacalo art in that. That was where Chris Bacalo became Chris Bacalo, was on Death: The High Cost of Living. And I will be a Chris Bacalo fan for the rest of my life. I don't care what weird shortcuts he takes now as an artist. He will always be one of my favorite artists, and it's mostly because I discovered his work in that mini at such a young age. So yeah, I feel kind of weird for a line that was so well known for being creator driven and specifically writer driven. My 5th and 4th picks, respectively, I'm picking almost entirely for the art. Yeah. But that was also a place where you could do things with the art and do weird experimental things like Philip Bond or Chris Bacalo and let them loose on series like this. And as good as the pros are, I mean, we're talking about Neil Gaiman and Grant Morrison, so of course the prose is unimpeachable, but the art was just fucking phenomenal on both of those. So I've got to, as much as I love Sandman, I've really got to give it up. If I could only hold on to one thing from the Sandman universe, I would pick out Death: The High Cost of Living. That's honestly
fair. No, it's very, very good. It's very good, and this is where it gets weird to me too. It's like, to really look at how big Vertigo really was, is my top 3 on this are basically also my top 3 just comics, period. I like there's a couple that are missing, but they're definitely in my top 5. My number 3 is Day Tripper.
Oh, I forgot that was Vertigo.
Yep. One of my all-time favorite comics, and a few comics actually get me teary-eyed and crying. So it hits extremely hard. I think one of the best and most personable and personal comics ever written. Gabriel Ba, Fabio Moon, coming at it very hard. One of the few books that they've done together, and it's completely them. And a book that really has cemented them as more than just these quirky artists. And a book that I think is continually over time becoming a bigger and bigger cult hit. It went from getting hardback editions to now I think next year it's getting its first absolute edition.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so
that's huge.
It keeps getting bigger and bigger over time, and I think that's something that shows the testament of that work. And it's another great one that I would say it used to be overlooked. I don't think it's as overlooked anymore, and with especially the re-releases. But I'm happy it's kind of getting the recognition it deserves finally.
I have a terrible confession to make. I own Day Tripper. I actually have the entire miniseries, and I still haven't read it. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons I haven't read it is because I know how emotionally wrenching it is, and I never find myself in a where I feel like mentally in a state where I can deal with emotionally wrenching, because I did that to myself once. I remember, and I think I've talked about this on the podcast before. When I read I Kill Giants, and I was like, I know this is supposed to be, a big emotional thing. I am not going to let it affect me. I'm going into this just saying, no, I'm just going to read this as a piece of text. I am not going to be emotionally affected. And by the final issue, I was sobbing. Like, I read the entire final issue through a sheen of tears, and I don't know if I can do that to myself again. So knowing that Day Tripper is as emotionally affecting as it is actually one of the reasons that I have avoided putting eyeballs on it.
Well, it's also like it's one of the few books that it matches its highs with its lows. As far as the highs of just being extremely happy and extremely comforting in a weird way, along with the dark depths, and it's a hard balance. And I'm still mad that I Killed Giants. The Giants were not real. I'm still mad about that.
Well, in the comic, they might be. In the movie, it's definitely implied that they're not.
Yeah, I'm tired of that. I want fantasy to be fantasy sometimes.
That's fair.
Yes. What is your number 3?
My number 3, I have a strong feeling we're going to talk about when we get to your number 2. My number 3 is John Constantine, Hellblazer.
Oh,
it's the Hellblazer series. Man, I fucking love John Constantine. Not as much as you do, but I am a big fan. I feel like Hellblazer it started out something special. You know, it started out even not even going back to Swamp Thing, but with Jamie Delano really had a very specific direction and a very specific tone he wanted to set for a horror comic, and I think he succeeded. But then after him, you had Garth Ennis, and after that 1-2 punch of Jamie Delano and Garth Ennis, I feel like for a really long time, Hellblazer was the book where prestige British writers went to show off.
Yeah, I mean, you have that.
And then Brian Azzarello came in and did the same thing.
Yeah, you have that time period where it's literally Neil Gaiman, Grant Morrison, and just like name after name after name. It almost became similar to like a Judge Dredd title for a while there. Just
it was basically an American Judge Dredd, yeah, in the sense of just the level of talent showing off on a character that was kind of cult but also beloved. Yeah, that's a good comparison, man.
Yeah, no, it was. It's if you look at like especially the newer volumes that just have all the names on the side. If you look at the names on there, it is insane to see just how many people were on that book and how many wrote great stories. Like you mentioned, Garth Ennis, Brian Azzarello.
Warren Ellis did 6 issues and murdered every single one.
Why can't I think of who ended the title?
Was it Diggle?
No, it wasn't Diggle. It was oh my god!
Because Diggle had a decent
Milligan?
run.
No, Milligan. I think it was Milligan that ended it.
You're right. Yeah. Diggle and then Diggle into Milligan. Yeah, Milligan ended it.
Yes, but yeah, Peter Milligan. You have so many Diggle. You have so many names that just when you think of oddly enough, specifically British comics, they were attached, and then you of course would also have people like Azzarello would come in and do these.
Jason Aaron did a 2-issue arc, which is insane. That in between, I want to say Jenkins' last issue and Ellis's first issue, there's like just this weird random 2-issue. No, that's somebody else. No, I think it's after Warren, but before Carey steps on, there's a 2-issue Jason Aaron arc, and it's just about Constantine's time as a punk rocker, and it's just like. And this was before Jason Aaron was Jason Aaron, so looking back, it's just like, holy shit, this is like early Jason Aaron. So
it's very much like Scott Snyder's Iron Man Noir or Jeff Johns' Avenger stuff, where it's like, oh wow, this exists.
Yeah, this is a thing that exists. Holy shit! Yeah, it's a tremendous title and a tremendous character. I think, like I said, I feel like Death is probably the Vertigo mascot character, but I don't think for a long time Hellblazer was the spine of the Vertigo universe. That was what kept it alive, propped it up, gave it structure, and that I feel like when Hellblazer ended at issue 300, I feel like that was the beginning of a long, slow drive towards the end for Vertigo. And I think we both felt that way at the time. Yeah. Where does Vertigo go without Hellblazer?
Yeah, we'll continue. My number 2 is Hellblazer.
I called it.
Yeah, right. It could have been. You could argue it could be number 1 too. These can go back and forth. But for sake of conversation, there's a big part of me that really kind of wishes Vertigo would have died when Hellblazer ended, because there's something that seems, or at least I can't remember if Fables ended after that or not. I can't remember. Whichever ended first, or whichever ended last, Fables or Hellblazer, whichever ended last, I feel like that should have been the final nail in the coffin and just move on to something else. in my personal
I
opinion.
want to say it was Hellblazer. I want to say Hellblazer stuck it out. And the reason they ended Hellblazer is because they wanted to put John Constantine back in the DCU.
Yeah.
And then after they kind of they didn't quite botch it with Brightest Day, but they did Brightest Day in order to get Constantine back in the DC universe. And then almost immediately the New 52 happened and kind of made that a moot point anyway. Which as much as I will defend the New 52 for a lot of reasons, that felt ill planned and dumb.
Yeah, well, it was weird because you had Justice League Dark. Yeah, there that weird time where you had Justice League Dark coming out, and you had the last few issues of Hellblazer. And Justice League Dark was actually the first like 2 volumes is pretty good on that. But that was also written by Milligan, I want to say, so that makes sense. But anyway, but then you got the Trinity War, you got the weird shit, and then you had like the really horrible Hellblazer, and then you had the really good Hellblazer. I mean, you really liked by
Tinian. It was Tinian, and but he had a co-writer, and I can't remember her name. Was it?
I can't remember. I'm sorry. Yeah,
I'm blanking on his co-writer, but yeah, Tinian
had a great like 12 issues.
And it was John Constantine, the Hellblazer, and it was like 12 issues, and it was phenomenal because it felt like Vertigo Hellblazer, and whenever you make Constantine feel like Vertigo Hellblazer, that's when it works. That's because that is who he is. That is his character. Whenever you take him outside of that environment, whenever you try to soften his edges, the character it doesn't work anymore. Yes, he started as a DC Universe character. Yes, there should be a version of that in the DC Universe, but if any time you try to soften his edges, especially in his own title, you're castrating the character in a way that just isn't necessary, and it's wrong to the character.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. They're the way to do a PG-13 version of him, but so many people don't know how at all that it is almost not worth it for a lot of it. Let's see. So Hellblazer ended in February 2013 and Fables in July 2015.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize Fables went on that long.
So, but either way, that should have been one of those, if not both, should have been the end for Vertigo, in my opinion. Well, what is your number 2?
Well, actually, it's kind of funny you said that your 1 and 2 can kind of switch out intermittently, because I feel that way very much about my 1 and 2 as well. But ultimately, gun to my head right now at this moment, my number 2 is Why the Last Man.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I adore Brian K. Vaughan. Brian K. Vaughan is one of my favorite writers in comics. For a long time, he was my favorite writer in comics, and a lot of that is because of Why the Last Man. The last 3 pages of Why the Last Man, number 60, the final issue, are quite possibly my 3 favorite pages in comics. I mean, it's really hard to put those up against some of the Cyclops stuff in Uncanny X-Men number 175, but I mean, there's an argument to be made that he escaped, and then that long, slow pullout over 3 pages may be my favorite pages in comics. Up to that last beautiful, perfect, just unimaginably perfect splash page. But every issue leading up to that, I remember I read Why the Last Man from issue 1, surprisingly enough. I didn't start it in trade. My roommate I was living with at the time was very, very into Warren Ellis and the Warren Ellis boards, and Warren Ellis had put out something about how people needed to start buying comics that just looked interesting, comics that did something new with the covers, didn't stick to traditional cover format. Yeah. And on that basis, he bought Why the Last Man number 1, because Why did not have a traditional first issue cover. And so I read Why the Last Man, and I bought those issues off of him at some point when he was broke. And it was before they got really super valuable, so I didn't super cheat him, but I did end up with his first 4 or 5 issues of Why. But yeah, I read Why from the first issue, and every single issue had the best cliffhanger you have ever read in comics. And it's so different to read something like that in a trade, or read something like that where you know that there is a next issue, or when the next issue is coming out, or that the series is ended. When you're reading that on a month-to-month basis, that screaming, clawing, driving need for the next issue is so different and so rare to maintain that level that Why did. But it's every issue. It is every issue.
Well, and you can compare it, because even fair comparison to Saga, where you could argue the first 24 issues of that have the exact same feeling from Brian K. Vaughan of great cliffhangers, great endings, you want to know, you need to know, and then along the way it kind of got muddled up where Why didn't really.
Yeah, no. Why? And then again, credit to artist Pia Guerrera did a phenomenal job designing characters, and very and this is the highest compliment I could pay. Very Steve Dillon in her facial expressions. You knew what her characters were thinking at all times, and considering so much of that book was dialogue and emotions and feeling, as instead of relying on action scenes or superhero poses or explosions. It was a character drama, and she absolutely sold the character, and kept she had to draw just several unique individual women and make them their own people, and she absolutely did over and over and over for 60 issues. And it's an amazing synergy of writer and artist. I feel the same way about my number one pick. We'll get to that in a second. But yeah, my number two, and so close to being my number one, Why the Last Man.
Yeah, that's a very good choice. That makes sense. My number one is a complete cheat, but it makes the list easier, because if not, this would have made the list much harder. So I'm just putting all of Grant Morrison's Vertigo work at number one.
That is a complete cheat. I really expected. If I had to put money on your list, I would have said Flex Metallo.
Yeah, well, I can't again, because in all fairness, if I picked these individually, my list would have literally been like Flex Metallo, The Invisibles, Doom Patrol, Hellblazer, Kill Your Boyfriend, Kid Eternity, so much other stuff. So for sake of conversation, it'd be mostly I'm gonna if I have to nerd in either Flex Metallo, Doom Patrol, or Invisibles. Those three, maybe Invisibles I'd put number one, just if I want to go long term format and what really represents Vertigo to me.
Right.
So I think Doom Patrol does have that, where in Animal Man 2, where even though it was Vertigo, it still very much fills DC and has call-outs to DC here and there. And Flex Metallo kind of spinning off from that, and it being just 4 issues, it feels so much of its own thing in a weird way that's hard to really do it. But Invisibles does feel very much a definitive Vertigo title, and it's also those 3 books, Invisibles, Doom Patrol, and Flex, being the books that I can say changed my mind as an artist and really probably changed who I am as a person, as just the ideas presented in them, how things are handled, how ahead of their time they are in so many ways. How you could argue up until 4 years ago, Invisibles was very timely and very good and at keeping with traditions and keeping with being ahead of the curve. But when I say that, it's probably 7 years ago now. Actually, my timeline's messed up, but still, at least
we're getting old, dude.
Well, at least more, not so much take away 2012 stuff, but more so the social elements up until it took that long for Invisibles to not be ahead of the curve, which is good and bad.
Right.
But I think that says a lot to where Grant Morrison was looking and just the mindset he put himself into for Invisibles, whether it be going to late night drag shows, going to punk clubs, to gay clubs, to cross-dressing, to experiencing all these different parts of life and throwing himself into that life to really flesh out these characters and putting himself, for better or worse, whatever personal opinions are, but into the psychedelic feel and into that level of chaos magic and everything, that whether it's real or not, he definitely believes it's real and is 100% dedicated to it, especially at that point, right? And it is one of those few books where you can feel the dedication in every line of that book. And also, I think another book that I think had for me personally, near perfect ending, and probably my favorite ending to a comic series of all time, of Now Our Sentence is Up, is one of my favorite ending lines to a comic ever.
Yeah.
And so probably if I have to gun to my head pick one for this list, probably Invisibles. And maybe we'll get a show of it one day. With the Umbrella Academy having its own show, to me anything is possible. So fucking, we got Doom Patrol, we got Umbrella Academy. I want an Invisible show now.
That's a fair request. I mean, you're right. They did Doom Patrol right. So the Invisibles isn't necessarily impossible. The only thing I would say is that The Invisibles, for being so ahead of its time, is also very much of its time in that it is very much a story about the end of the millennium.
Yes.
You know, it's very much the story about coming upon the year 2000. And I don't know if you can do The Invisibles and I hate to say this, I don't know if you can do it in a post 9/11 world, just because the optimism and trepidation that we had going into the new millennium doesn't really exist post what we allowed to happen with our security in the response to that attack.
I agree in one sense, but I also look at, because that is, I think that's more heavy in the earlier parts, but especially in the middle of the book, so much more of that book is all just about self-discovery.
Right.
That I think, and honestly, I mean, if you want to get down to it, then this might be offensive to some, but like so much of that book is about identity politics and about what it is to be who you are. I mean, honestly, like if you even to this day, I would hold the issues of Boy going through finding out who they are, the person. I think that could be updated to, like, especially TV show wise, extremely well now if you wanted to.
Yeah, that's fair. I think that's the key word. Is if you were going to adapt Invisibles, you'd really have to update it, and I don't think that's impossible. I just think it's necessary.
I think you'd have to update kind of the scenery and some of them. I don't know mentality. I think it's just if you just did it kind of in a modern world, I think that would naturally happen, because I think so much of it is very much of that time, that culture, but so much of that. For better and worse, we're facing a lot of the same ideas, because even though we're moving forward, it's still at a snail's pace in some regards. So especially when it comes to the bigger ideas of sex, religion, who you are, and all stuff. I think you can definitely focus on that.
Transgender identity.
Yes, transgender identity, sexual identity, being, crap. You could argue the entire point of half that book is about being fluid. There's so much of that I think you could very much just take literally those same ideas and also just put it with the more knowledge we know now and just push it forward. I think that's where a book like that, where people, I know there are parts of that book that could be offensive nowadays, but again, that's one of those key ones. If you look at how ahead of just it was for even questioning and bringing up those topics at that time, where it was such an underground movement that so many people didn't even realize things like that existed.
Right.
They didn't understand that what being trans was, what the idea of not feeling comfortable in your own gender was, what not feeling not comfortable in your own body, not feeling comfortable in your own depression and your own mentality and your own whatever that may be, whatever your issues are. That book was very ahead in the fence of even talking about those ideas, and that's where Vertigo was so good about, like, giving a platform that had an audience to actually go for it. And that's something that I think you could really update very well to a new thing. Because again, I know, especially with 2012 stuff, the millennia stuff, all of that, you definitely would have to. I don't know if you had to you would definitely have to update it to something different. But I think
probably environmental concerns and the ticking clock that we now have as far as climate change and what little we can actually do to not even reverse, but at this point, stave off imminent destruction.
Yeah, there's a lot of that you talk about. I mean, and the ideas of mind pollution, honestly, when you include social media, you can, those ideas.
Shit, I didn't even think about that angle. Yeah, that's a really good point.
You could, just lean way into that. But yeah, there's so many, and I haven't even mentioned stuff like the filth. But, and that's
the filth. That's a good one.
That's another all-time favorite. So yeah, it's hard for me. That's why, mostly, so I don't just spend the entire list of it just being Grant Morrison books.
That's a good call. I didn't think to cheat like that. That's really good. So my number one, I have a bit of an anecdote. I saw someone post on Twitter today. They were asking what writer political writer most influenced your politics, and Chris Bird, Mighty God King, had a really good answer, and the third on his list was Terry Pratchett, and I absolutely 100% agree with that. A lot of my thoughts about politics are very much influenced by Terry Pratchett, but I've also realized that so much of my political thinking was affected by Warren Ellis, and very specifically from Transmetropolitan.
I expected that, to be honest.
Hunter S. Thompson in the future will never not be a good idea. Derek Robertson worked his balls off every single issue to make that comic special. Warren Ellis predicted the rise of George W. Bush. Warren Ellis had a righteous and understandable anger at American politics and American submission to the status quo that he desperately tried to wake readers up to. And unfortunately, for as many people as found the book entertaining, I think a lot of people didn't take the real world connotative messages from it. I think it's a work that stands on its own today. I think it's a work that remains unfortunately relevant all these years later. And you mentioned that The Invisibles actually had your favorite final line in comics. Transmet may actually have my favorite final spoken line of dialogue, 1%. Is one of, like, I cracked up when I saw that, when I read it. And if you don't know what that means, go read the comic because the context is kind of incredible.
Yeah, I will say one thing about this. Transmetropolitan, I think, how many issues is it?
It's 60 some odd. I think it's like 66 issues.
I will say it's not too long. That's my only problem with Invisibles being number one. It's a great book to recommend, but it's a lofty, heavy read. Those final 13 issues are a motherfucker. Yeah. I don't know what it is about Volume 3 that always snags me. It may be the Philip Bond art, but there's something about Volume 3 that just always, like, Volume 2, and Grant Morris has said this in interviews. The entirety of Volume 2 was his action movie. That's why you have art like Phil Jimenez and other more traditional comics artists on there, because it was very much more like a blockbuster action story starring the Invisibles. And then Volume 3 is very much a drug trip, and it brings all the themes and ideas together, but it is a motherfucker to get through. And whereas Transmetropolitan is like the comic book equivalent of shooting meth into your eyeballs. Yeah, it's a good. You want to go with it. If we compare drugs, I would say that's fair. That's got a. If you're looking for a very up, coked out, methed out book, I would say Transmetropolitan. If you want a acid trip, peyote trip, you go Invisible. Whichever day you're feeling like it, that's the direction you need to head.
Yeah, that's I can 100% agree with that. But yeah, if we're talking about books that have had genuine effects on me as a person, that affected the way I thought, not just about comics, but about the real world, Transmetropolitan with a bullet.
And see, I think that's the best thing Vertigo probably ever did, is the fact that most of what we just talked about, especially with our number ones, are both books that highly, highly, highly affected us as people on more than just this is a good story level.
Right. And
that's what Vertigo, especially in that time frame, I mean, they had great books, but if you want to narrow it in on from 95 to 2005, that decade, and yes, there was a lot before it too, but that decade had so many books that I felt like were very much, and it may, whether it be the coming millennium and people just really thinking about their place in the universe, and that late time of where we were as a human race and where America was, it spawned some very interesting writings, and I think Vertigo was at the cutting edge of that in all of literature, to be honest. I think literature in general had some great stuff going on, but Vertigo was really kind of forward-thinking, and especially books like Transmetropolitan and Invisible seem to capitalize on that in a way that very few...
To make a weird but I think apt comparison, Vertigo was the teen Vogue of the late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah, I can see that. I'll get down with that. They were definitely much more ahead of where people, even at the time, looking from just, I mean, I was there, but not reading, but there was just hearing stories and hearing stuff and just seeing where we were. I don't think people gave it credit. I think at the time people knew it was ahead of its time. I don't think at that time people really understood how ahead of a time it was.
Yeah, that's, speaking as someone who was there and was a bit more cognizant, that's absolutely true. That is 100% true.
I think there's times and like zeitgeist and culture that you don't realize how big they are till they've ended, and I think that's one reason with Vertigo ending where I'm kind of happy because let's be honest, when we think of Vertigo, almost all of us think of that time period.
Yeah, it's when we think of Vertigo, we're thinking, and I hate to say it because it makes me feel old, but we're thinking 20 years ago.
Yeah, and that's why I think
at the most recent.
Yeah, and I think that's why that's even if you think about Fables and stuff at this point in time, that's still 4, 5, 6 years ago. So I think that's why it's for me. I think it's a fitting burial and a fitting end to Vertigo to kind of. It's kind of sucks for Vertigo to go out more in a whimper than a bang, but I think that's just because it feels like it's been on a lifeline for 10 years now.
Yeah.
And I'm happy because even though Vertigo's ending, and we got all these great books and this great stuff, we mentioned, I think it's very important to reiterate, there are so many other titles now and other companies that are doing that same thing. DC, again, with Young Animal, with the Joe Hill horror stuff, with Black Label, with kid stuff like DC Inc., with all these weird chances they're actually taking in the main DC line, with Image still doing a lot of stuff, Dark Horse trying lots of great stuff.
I was going to say, Dark Horse chugging along, doing the best they can. Image, for as much as we kind of complain about their output, they're still fucking trying.
Little Bird has been killing. Little Bird might be the best book of the year that is slowly getting the recognition it deserves, and it is so amazing. It's such a weird, it feels like a European underground book that somehow Image is producing.
That's phenomenal. I've got to give a shout out to Ahoy Comics because they're really coming up out of nowhere to kind of take over the place that, like, you know, Oni and Boom used to kind of have before whatever the fuck happened with Oni and Boom.
Yeah, even Black Mask and IDW here recently have been trying so many weird things from their Karen Berger line to other just crazy things that have been going on in comics. Like, a lot of people are trying riskier things. There's a million digital outlets that are trying some very unique things. I think at the time. And
that's Vertigo's legacy. Yeah. I mean, for as much as we talk about, you know, Sandman being a legacy book or Hellblazer being a legacy book, the legacy of Vertigo is quality comics from great creators, and that's still going on in the industry today. Like you said, Karen Berger has a line of, you know, comics. She's still editing phenomenal, interesting, weird comics from phenomenal, interesting, weird people. Image wouldn't be what Image is today if Vertigo hadn't laid the groundwork for that. That's the Vertigo legacy. The comics that we have today, the comics landscape would be entirely different without Vertigo.
Yeah, no, I mean, Vertigo is. I mean, you definitely see it nowadays, but you can't have comics today or many things if you take Vertigo out of the equation. I mean, I hate comparing stuff to such huge things, but in a lot of ways, it really is like that. Just the Beatles showing up, or Black Sabbath kind of coming out, or it is the equivalent of Tupac. It is the equivalent, like that game changer that just changed everything from that point forward. Like nothing came after that wasn't at least in some way influenced by that, or something that was influenced by that.
Right, I agree. So, and I think that more or less closes our door on Vertigo, at least for now. Literally look forward to talking about other things coming out from DC and from other also inspired companies in the future. We want to know what you think. What were your favorite Vertigo books? Yes. What are your favorite Vertigo memories? We would love to know. You can leave us a comment below here on YouTube or on SoundCloud. You can find us on our email address, blahblahcomics at gmail. It's blahblahpodcast@gmail.com. I apologize.
Yes.
We're on Facebook, facebook.com/blahblahpodcast. We're on Twitter. I run the @blahblahpod account.
I'm at HellhoundF5.
And you can find us on Instagram, where I am also at @blahblahpodcast, and I mostly just post snippets of things I've written.
Yep, and I'm saying HellhoundF5. It's mostly.
And you recently posted a video of you playing some drums, and I was deeply impressed. It was very cool.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, I saw 21 Pots again, and they, as always, were super inspiring, and so I've been putting out more videos of that stuff here lately. So, yeah, if you want to see more drumming and weird stuff, that'll be on there.
That's awesome. Hopefully we'll be back next week. Our schedule lately has been wonky as fuck, but hopefully things will be getting more on a traditional scale. We may have just a more traditional blah blah coming out where we do the comics and pop culture thing. But we, like I said, we really wanted to celebrate Vertigo this time, even if it was going to be a shorter episode. But thank you all so much for listening. Again, tell us what you're thinking. We're still accepting submissions for future comics collisions.
Yes.
We had a fantastic submission from our producer Lance recently that I think may actually be something that we do in the future for sure. I was impressed by that one, so that's what I'd like to do.
I think it's a really good one.
So yeah, just let us know what you're thinking, and as always, thank you so much for listening. I could talk to Colby all day just on my own, but it's so nice to do it and have some other people enjoy it as well.
Yes, thank you all for listening. I always love talking to Derek. I love talking comics to all you people. But until next time, so long and good night.
Good night, everybody.